There's a lot of hand-wringing that goes on when it comes to inflation. One of the primary objectives for the Reserve Bank here in Australia and other central banks around the world is to control inflation, which they do by adjusting interest rates. Inflation is entirely to blame for the hikes in rates that we've seen recently. Governments also have a role, though, in their spending choices. Given inflation gets so much attention, this week I wanted to dig into why that is and its relevance to your retirement savings and investment portfolios. There's lots of things governments and agencies could choose to focus on: unemployment, economic growth, income per capita, innovation, social services, the green energy transition, and plenty more. Given all these potentially competing priorities, why does inflation feature so prominently in our economic discourse? Well, thanks for listening to another episode of the Financial Autonomy Podcast. My name's Paul Benson. I'm a financial planner and practice principal at Guidance Financial Services. All right, let's dive into this week's episode. Why does inflation matter? There's lots of attention given to inflation. You'll hear it in the news, you'll hear it from the Reserve Bank, and you've probably felt it yourself every time you've gone to the supermarket or filled up the car. But it's worth stepping back and asking a simple question: why does inflation matter so much? Because governments and central banks could focus on a lot of things, as I already touched on, things like economic growth, unemployment, living standards, those type of things. Yet, time and time again, inflation sits front and centre. So today, I want to unpack why that is, and more importantly, what it means for your retirement savings and your investment decisions. So let's start with the basics. Inflation is simply the rate at which prices increase over time. If inflation is running at 3%, then on average, things cost 3% more than they did a year ago. Now, that might not sound like much, but over time it has a powerful impact because inflation quietly erodes the value of your money. As an illustration, if you had $100,000 sitting in cash and inflation averaged 3% per year, then in 10 years' time, that money would only buy what's about $74,000 would buy you today. That's a big loss in purchasing power, and it happens in the background whether we notice it or not. As a side note, this is why term deposits are terrible investments generally. It might feel like your money's secure, but actually its value is constantly getting nibbled away. But here's the key point. The reason inflation gets so much attention from our economic managers. Inflation isn't just about prices going up, it's also about uncertainty. When inflation is low and stable, people and businesses can plan. You can make decisions about spending, saving, investing, and borrowing with a reasonable degree of confidence. But when inflation is high or unpredictable, things start to break down. Businesses struggle to set prices. Employees push for higher wages. Borrowers and lenders become more cautious. And that uncertainty slows economic activity. That's why central banks like the Reserve Bank of Australia place such a strong emphasis on keeping inflation within a target range. Typically 2 to 3% here in Australia. You sometimes hear of them talk about inflation becoming unanchored. So what they're worried about there is that people lose that confidence that inflation's always going to average in that 2 to 3% range. They don't want people to get it in their heads that, hey, we need to plan for inflation at 5% or 6% or something like that, because that then just rolls through everything in the economy and is incredibly detrimental. So, how do they control inflation? Well, primarily through interest rates. When inflation's running hot, the Reserve Bank increases interest rates, and of course we've seen that in recent months. Higher rates make borrowing more expensive, which tends to slow down spending and investment. Less spending means less demand, and that brings inflation back under control. We've seen that play out quite clearly over the past couple of years. Rates have risen sharply, and that's been uncomfortable, particularly for those with mortgages, but it's all part of the effort to get inflation back into that target band. Now, it's worth just sort of noting at this point, or highlighting, I suppose, its impact isn't equal or fair, if you like, right? Rising interest rates means that those with borrowings have less money in their pocket, and so they're the ones that have to make the adjustment. They're the ones that have to spend less. Whereas, of course, those with money in the bank, actually higher interest rates give them a little bit more money to spend. So it's a blunt tool, raising interest rates, but it does nevertheless have an impact, and it tends to control inflation. Of course, as I mentioned at the top, government spending is another way to control inflation. So it's not the only tool, but getting governments to rein in spending can be challenging. So they tend to lean pretty heavily on adjusting interest rates. All right, now let's bring this all back to you. So why does inflation matter for your retirement planning? Well, there's three big reasons. So number one, your lifestyle in retirement depends on purchasing power, not just dollars. It's easy to think in terms of having a certain balance, say $1 million in super, but what really matters is what $1 million can buy. If inflation is higher than expected, then your savings won't stretch as far. This is particularly important for retirees because you don't have employment income to adjust for rising costs. Your portfolio needs to do the heavy lifting. Retirees, therefore, are the most exposed to the risk of higher inflation. Number two is that inflation shapes investment returns. Different asset classes respond differently to inflation. Cash and fixed interest tend to struggle when inflation is high because their returns are often fixed. If you're earning 4% on a term deposit and inflation is 4%, you're effectively going nowhere. In contrast, growth assets like shares and property tend to provide some level of protection over time. That's because companies can often increase their prices, which flows through to revenue and profits. With property, you tend to be able to increase the rent to keep up with inflation, and indeed most commercial lease agreements have built-in inflation protection. It's not perfect and it can be volatile, but over the long term, shares and property have historically outpaced inflation. Number three, inflation influences interest rates, and interest rates influence everything else. So when rates rise, it impacts borrowing costs, asset valuations, and investor behaviour. We've seen this recently with property price growth stalling as the Reserve Banks put interest rates up. Share markets are becoming more volatile. Now, of course, the Iran conflict had an impact on that, but nevertheless, even so, inflation is a contributor, and we have seen some fall in bond prices as well. So even if inflation feels like an abstract concept, its ripple effects are very real. All right, so now an interesting question is, what happens if inflation's too low? Generally, people are worried about inflation being too high, and that's certainly the current concern. But actually, inflation too low is a problem too, right? So very low inflation, or even worse, deflation, which means prices are actually going down, can lead to people delaying spending because they're expecting prices to fall further. So if you were contemplating, I don't know, buying a new television or a new car or something, and you thought that, hey, a year from now, it's probably going to be cheaper than it is today, then you would delay that purchase. And if everyone does that, then you get no economic activity, which, obviously craters the economy and causes unemployment. So central banks, they want to keep inflation low, but they certainly don't want it zero. Well, they don't want it zero. They certainly don't want it negative, right? So they're trying to have low inflation, and the Reserve Bank's target, as I've already mentioned, 2 to 3%. Now, interestingly, in the US, they don't have that band. Theirs is just a straight 2%. So different nations tackle that slightly differently. But the objective always is low inflation, but some inflation, right? Now, another one that comes up or has been coming up just recently is the concept of stagflation. It's just getting a little bit of coverage at the moment, so I thought it was worth mentioning that in this episode too. Stagflation is an economic environment where simultaneously you get high inflation, so prices rising quickly, low or even negative economic growth, so the economy is just stalling, and high unemployment. So it's a pretty dreadful situation all round. Now, it's been quoted a bit in the press recently because the last time we experienced this phenomenon was in the oil shock of the 1970s. The fact that we haven't seen this combination of economic events in over 50 years tells you how rare and therefore unlikely it is. This is because it would be rare that prices would be pushing up at the same time that unemployment was high. If lots of people are out of work, that tends to depress wages because people compete for the jobs that are available. A stagflation environment is certainly an undesirable one, but Australia finding ourselves in this position, it's not something that's causing me to lose sleep. So if you see that getting mentioned in the press, frankly, I wouldn't be too concerned. All right, so what should you do with all of this? Well, here's a few practical takeaways. Firstly, don't ignore inflation when setting your retirement targets. So make sure your plans are based on real inflation-adjusted returns, not just nominal figures. And for the guidance clients that are listening, of course, you will know that when we do your modelling and your projections, we usually start with them in nominal terms, but we always adjust them to be in real terms as well, so you can see them expressed both ways. Maintain exposure to growth assets. This is really important. Even in retirement, having an allocation to shares or property can help protect your purchasing power over time. Being too conservative, whilst it seems like the prudent thing to do, can actually be very risky, particularly if we get a bit of inflation. And a knock onto that is be cautious with safe assets. So cash feels safe because the balance doesn't move, but inflation is quietly eating away at it in the background. And also expect interest rate cycles. So what we've experienced recently with rising rates is not unusual. It's part of the economic cycle driven by inflation dynamics. So rates will go up for a period, the economy will slow down a bit, inflation will come down, and then interest rates, of course, will adjust down. And if the economy slows too much, then they'll cut interest rates particularly low and try and give the economy a boost to get it back up again. So interest rates move in cycles, so plan for that. And if you are doing fixed interest type investments, just kind of consider that as part of the duration of how long you lock your money in for. So look, to wrap up, inflation matters because it sits at the intersection of almost everything in the economy. It affects how far your money goes, it influences interest rates, and it shapes investment returns. For retirees and those approaching retirement, it's particularly important because it's not just about how much money you have, but how long it will last. So next time you hear about inflation in the headlines, it's not just economic noise. It's one of the key forces determining your financial future. All right. Well, look, before we wrap up, if you found this episode helpful or interesting, hopefully both, share it with a friend or someone that you think might benefit with it. That would be greatly appreciated. If you're not already, make sure you subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Of course, I've got the column in the Fairfax newspapers around the country, so Sydney Morning Herald, Age, Brisbane Times, whatever the relevant Fairfax paper is in your state. So if you would like to ask me a question, in the show notes, there's the email address that you can send those through to. And if you're not already getting our weekly email, which is the Gaining Choice email, make sure you pop yourself on the list for that. There's no cost to that. You can unsubscribe at any time, but it's a good way to just keep your head across, what's going on in markets and that sort of stuff. And again, there's a link in the show notes so you can get onto that one. All right. Thanks for listening. Have a wonderful weekend, I guess, depending on when you're consuming this. And I'll be back in a fortnight's time. Bye for now.